Welcome everybody. This is session 4. As you can tell, we've had to tape it because this is a revamp of the old one we did a couple of years ago. So we've redone it to add a bit more meat to it, combined a bit more, try to get a bit more of the principles in it. So you'll find if you're asking questions, what I'll do is repeat the question for the benefit of the tape. I don't know how frustrating you find it, but you can hear somebody talking in the background, but you don't know what they're saying when you've got the tape. So I'll repeat the question just so people know what's been asked as a question. So tonight we're doing two very important topics when it comes to prayer counseling. So in our last session, we looked at the various aspects of deliverance. We discovered what demons are, whether Christians can have evil spirits, how to pray for deliverance, and the possibilities of self-deliverance. Any questions from last week on self-deliverance, now that you've had a little bit of chance to think through issues? None that comes to mind real quick? Okay, in this session we'll consider another 2 tools of prayer counseling: inner healing and breaking curses. We will look at how such concepts fit in with the Bible teaching, the different aspects within each category, and how these 2 areas of prayer counseling can help liberate Christians today. So in this whole unit, we're giving you an overview of different tools that prayer counselors can use. It's like having this toolbox that you use the different tools for the different situations that you're in. Just like you wouldn't take a screwdriver and use it as a hammer, hopefully not. You'd use the right tool for the right situation. So this unit, this has been our concept or idea behind it, to present lots of different tools that prayer counselors will be using. So tonight we're talking about 2 very important ones: inner healing and breaking curses. Curses are one of those sort of pseudo-Christian things that float around from lots of different churches. And I've tried really hard tonight to pin it down so we know what we mean when we talk about breaking curses. Because that's one of those sort of nebulous ideas that we as Christians need to know what the Bible means and what it really means when we're talking about generational curses, because that's something that we hear a lot about. Capital B, Jesus is the great healer of emotional pain. Jesus is the great healer of emotional pain. One of the greatest hindrances to evangelism is that hurt, broken, immature Christians are trying to win others to Christ. How can we win the lost unless we're better off than they are? They must want what we have. Jesus came to bring abundant life, not miserableness. In John 10:10. We are told in Isaiah 61:1 that the Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me to preach good news to the poor. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted and to proclaim freedom for the captives and the release of prisoners. And this was Jesus' commission. This was his mandate. This is what he was sent to do. Just as Jesus was anointed to proclaim freedom for the prisoners by the breaking of curses, he was also sent to heal the brokenhearted, and that's inner healing. The Lord comes to us at times of distress. His answer is to allow our heart to be healed by his presence and to soak in his warmth and the truth until we're healed. Jesus also became a curse on our behalf. We are entitled through the cross to be free from all demonic bondages. So the first topic we're going to talk about tonight is inner healing. So let's start out with capital A, the theory behind inner healing. The theory behind inner healing. In recent years, both Christian psychiatrists and counselors have been stressing the importance of a process called the healing of memories, or inner healing. The process is based on the concept that many of us have repressed and buried painful emotions and memories. Sometimes the mind handles the traumatic, intense wounds by allowing them to sink below conscious memory. And I think this is one of the ways that God planned and created into human beings to be able to cope with and stand the amount of pain that people go through. It's an automatic cutoff switch in the mind, where if things get too traumatic, it's like everything just goes away for a while. And I think it's a God-given protection so that it doesn't get so traumatic that we go off the deep end. So it's a protection mechanism built in from God. However, these memories from the past continue to bubble up from the unconscious mind and affect our conscious feelings and behavior today. The goal is to allow these memories into the realm of conscious awareness, experience them, release them, and then to get on with life. So everything that's happened to you since, and I would believe before birth, sometimes the Lord's even showed them what went on before conception. But all of those memories are buried somewhere deep inside. Now, certainly the little baby did not have the logical, conscious mechanism to think thoughts, and that doesn't happen until, certainly way after birth somewhere along the line. But it's like the spirit has a recording mechanism going on in there. If you want to call it the subconscious, the heart, but it's like all of that just gets buried deep, deep, deep down inside in there. Now, I don't know about you, but I have trouble remembering what it was like before 5 years of age. But that's still in there somewhere. It's still in the computer brain, the computer processing of what happened in my life before I was 5. And certainly that's what happens for everybody's life. So, the aim of inner healing is to somehow get in touch with those memories, particularly when they're traumatic memories, and bring them up to the conscious level so that you can remember what was happening there, to experience them, release them, and certainly in inner healing it's releasing them through God's love and through His healing touch so that you can get on with life. Because just because we don't remember what happened to us when we went through traumatic events in our childhood doesn't mean it's gone away, because it's still in there in the computer mind somewhere. For some, these memories can become infected and turn inwards, becoming worse, often spreading to other areas. In severe situations, disassociation and splitting can happen, adding deeper personality issues to resolve. If we do not allow a healthy healing process, some of these memories can attack the body's health even. The pain may later appear as some physical illness or some cycle of spiritual defeat. Diane.
What would you say the difference between someone burying a memory, so it's sort of unconscious, and splitting?
So what's the difference between burying a memory and splitting? Burying a memory is the normal process for everyone. Splitting comes when someone has gone through such a traumatic memory that it's like they disassociate. So like the mind actually shuts down, but part of them goes somewhere else. And this is the process if someone's gone through sexual ritual abuse where an actual alternative personality has been formed. Because if it's done in a deliberate way, they actually teach a little child how to disassociate. And in the disassociation, they go somewhere else, and it's almost like they create another personality. So the splitting part is probably further along on the continuum line. So you start out, all of us over here, when trauma gets too much, we shut down. That's just a normal, healthy function that God has put into our brain. But somewhere along the line, people begin to shut down, and then they begin to split. And then somewhere along the line, they shut down, they split, and another personality is formed. And then if you carry that down a little bit further, they shut down, disassociate, split, in quite a few different personalities. A cluster personality is sort of. Right? So does that answer it? Splitting was probably the more traumatic, the more extended along the continuum line that leads to multiple personalities. Does that answer it? Now, some of these memories that we've buried, actually, it's like combine with the physical body, and some physical illnesses and some physical pain can be directly related back to buried traumatic memories that people haven't gotten in touch with. And those are called psychosomatic. So that there is some connection between the thinking process and the trauma that's happened in the past. And to some degree, all of us sort of go through that. If you feel up on your shoulders and your neck's really tight, what would that be telling you? That there's a lot of tension. Yeah. So sometimes the spiritual and the physical combine, and deeper physical issues begin to develop. People who have never faced their painful memories and have been loosed from them are still hung up at a certain age, and therefore cannot leave childhood things behind. they can be stuck at a certain stage in development. And one example is Marty and his story about Mom and the chopping block. And I think I've already shared this story with you. It's public knowledge. It's part of his testimony. But Marty was the last of about 5 children, a little boy, and along about when he was 4 years old, normal, active, go-get-him little 4-year-old that was just all over the place. One day, Mom, in her exasperation at him not sitting still and doing what he was told to do, she grabbed him by the collar, took him outside to the chopping block where they cut the heads off the chickens. She threw him down on the chopping block and she said, "If you don't behave, I'm going to do to you what they do to the chickens." Now, what would that do to a 4-year-old little boy? Certainly traumatized him. And the Lord has taken him back to that memory. And at that point, he told himself that emotions are dangerous things. And so I'm not going to show my emotions anymore. And at that moment, he closed down his emotional growth. So part of his testimony is that now he's a married man in his 30s. He's got a beautiful wife and 3 lovely daughters. But the biggest comment that his wife would have made about him is there was just no emotions. She couldn't get in touch with these emotions. They just like it was an ice block deep inside. And so as the Lord began working with him, the Lord took him back to that spot when he was 4 years old. So when the traumatic memories aren't dealt with, it's like part of us gets stuck at that age. So we can have people in their 40s, 50s, 60s, even in the physical body, but inside they're like 5, 10, 12 years old because some traumatic event has happened at that point, and it's like part of their personality gets stuck at that point. A past experience is not isolated from other events. Everyday living can trigger off the same reaction when in similar circumstances to the first event. Any unresolved areas can become the doors through which the enemy can still touch our life. Thus, both good and bad events from the past continue to touch our life in the here and now. And a really good example of that is someone recently who came in that said she was having trouble with her boss at work. And her boss, she found, was domineering, overbearing, critical, etc., etc., etc. She had a huge, long list about her boss. And so we began to investigate her boss, and she began to share a little bit about her childhood with us as well. And it was interesting to find out, she said, "Oh yeah, I can remember I had a year 12 teacher that was domineering, bossy, etc., etc., etc." The very same list that she'd given us of the boss. And then she said, "Oh yes, I had a roommate in university who was just like that." And the more she began to dig and the deeper she went down into her memories, she said, "But the real culprit was my mother." So if I'd taught her 15 different ways to handle her boss, would that have helped? Probably would have helped a little bit, but the real root of the issue was back with mother. So because of the traumatic events and the unresolved stuff with mother, it's like it got triggered with her year 12 teacher, got triggered with her roommate at university, got triggered with her boss at work. So the answer wasn't so much the boss at work, because the traumatic, unhealed stuff was way back with mother. And so she was in reaction whenever she was with somebody that was like mother. So that's a good example of how the past can keep coming up and almost hitting us in the face. We have covered the inner healing topic in more depth in Unit 12, the Psychology of Jesus, especially Sessions 3 and 4. We have included Appendix A from Session 12-4 with these notes. However, due to the private commercial ownership of the ministry named Theophostic, we'll call our worksheet Steps for the Inner Healing Journey. So when we were back in Session 12, we talked about the Psychology of Jesus, and we did a pretty in-depth study on inner healing at that point. And we taught some of the principles of what was called Theophostic counseling. How many people have heard of that term before? Yeah. But since way back then, the name has been copyright, so it's commercial ownership, so we won't be talking about Theophostic counseling anymore. And what Theophostic was a bit further step on from the old inner healing concepts that was around in churches. So they've taken it just a little bit further on. So we're not going to call it Theophostic anymore. We call it Steps to the Inner Healing Journey. And that's Appendix A, and we'll get back to that in just a minute. Any comments so far? So basically, inner healing gets in touch with the things that we've buried, that we've suppressed, that we've disassociated from in some cases, that we've just blocked away, the trauma that still affects us today. Now, certainly not everything that we went through in our childhood is affecting us today. And it's the Lord is the one that knows which issues we need to deal with and which issues we don't need to deal with. So hanging on to Him and allowing Him to take us through what we need to deal with is the key to a lot of this stuff. Because like we've said before, we could spend the next 50 years helping each other get spit and polished perfect, and God wouldn't love us any more. Or He could take us home tomorrow and He wouldn't love us any less. So the object of all of this stuff is not to get spit and polished perfect. It's to do what Jesus is telling us to do. So don't get overwhelmed if there's a lot of stuff that you feel like you haven't dealt with in your past. And certainly as we talk about these different topics, lots of stuff comes up for people. It's interesting sitting here. It's like you can see little light bulbs going, little ping, ping all around the room. So don't get overwhelmed if you feel the Lord's just uncovered huge rooms in your heart of stuff you haven't dealt with. The aim is to do it step by step the way that the Lord's telling you. Okay? Does that help? Yes?
You mentioned about personalities splitting.
Uh-huh.
Now, I know there's been an awful lot of controversy regarding split personalities, but what part of the person...
what part splits? Really splits?
Yes.
Well,
it would all be one heart, one
yes.
soul, wouldn't it?
Yes.
It has to be.
Yes.
So what part of the person would be...
What part of the person actually splits? Well, certainly the memories trigger the closing down process, so that part of the mind just sort of, just closes down. So what part of it would be? Anybody else like to help me on this question? Yeah? Okay, so basically the soul is what part splits. So when we talk about the soul, we're talking about the mind and the emotions. I don't think it's not the spirit, it's not the conscience, and often the heart is still, certainly shattered and bruised and broken, but there's still just one heart for us. So it would be the emotions and the logical thinking process that it just jumps a track and a whole new personality gets started that has the emotions that go with that traumatic event. Any other questions? Okay, objections to inner healing. Capital B, the objections to inner healing. Number one, inner healing is New Age. Inner healing is New Age. Some people have made accusations that inner healing is only another New Age practice camouflaged with Christian trappings. Sometimes we lose the truth that God is restoring to His people just because others have misused it. We don't get rid of the policemen just because there are a few crooked ones. However, we must always use biblical guidelines to check out the ministry. Just because something works doesn't mean God has approved. What might be some guidelines you would set when it comes to inner healing? Give me some suggestions. What are some guidelines you'd set? Guided by the Holy Spirit, but okay, that's fairly nebulous because some people say, I know God told me this, but you've got just that little question in your mind. But yes, hopefully guided by the Holy Spirit. What else? It's got to be based on what the Bible says. That's right. If whoever it is working with you comes up with a new set of principles that are not found in the Bible, then the caution light needs to start going on. What else? Does God get the glory? Rather than this person has their name up in lights and they're the one that gets all the glory in the whole thing? Good, yes. What's another one? One of the things we as Christians need to check out is whether their private life matches the charisma of the public life. Because it's very easy to get our eyes on the gifting, the anointing of a person's life, and not check out their theology, not check out whether their private life matches their public life. And there's been a lot of pain in the church groups, particularly when they get into cults, where the anointing over somebody's life might be awesome, but their private life doesn't match their public life. So just because something works doesn't mean it's got God's approval, because there are a lot of New Age practices that work, but they don't have God's stamp of approval on them. So we need to be cautious of some of the stuff that's out there. Certainly the peace of the Holy Spirit, if you leave that person where everything's just churned up, either you've misheard them, they've said something that's just slightly off base, or something's happening there you need to stop and question. Even to say, hey, I've lost my peace in here. What do you mean when you're saying whatever, whatever, whatever? So the peace of the Holy Spirit's meant to be the umpire. You know, when you've got these two opposing teams, what does the umpire do? They're the one that blows the whistle. They're the ones that decides the call. They're the ones that say, oh, that's out of bounds or that's not out of bounds. So the peace of the Holy Spirit needs to be our referee, the umpire in matters like this. So if you ever lose your peace, then you need to stop and sort out what's going on in that situation. 2, another objection to inner healing. Inner healing is imagination rather than God. That inner healing is imagination rather than God. Vision or sanctified imagining is valid, provided we only initiate the process, like when we do with praise and worship. When He is in charge of the dialogue, then the visualization will change from soulless imagination to true spiritual vision. However, we do not direct the process with our own direction. So in other words, we can set the scene. We can say, Jesus, there's a room in my heart where I'm keeping all my anger. So Lord, show me what's happening in that room. So we've set the scene, and even sometimes we can start out by sanctified imagination, by just picturing a room. And then somewhere along the process, the Holy Spirit comes and takes over. And then the Lord begins to do things in that room. To me, where the dividing line is we don't say, okay, Jesus, there's the door. Now walk through the door, Jesus. And there's the light switch. Jesus, turn on the light switch. And Jesus, there's all those shelves over there. What are we going to do about all those shelves? Yes, Jesus, you pick up that book and I'll work with it. All right? That's us directing what's happening in the process. So when inner healing process is happening, we can set the stage, but after that we let the Lord do what He needs to do in that. Because often his creativity is so far beyond our imagination that it's just great just to hang on to His hand and let Him do what He needs to do. I've seen the Lord come in and knock out walls, put in windows, repaint walls. Just amazing some things that the Lord does when we allow Him to do what He needs to do in the picture. So any questions on those two? Those are the two main objections when people talk about inner healing. One, that they feel that it's just the New Age stuff creeping into it, the visualization, the seeing things happening. And then that's what our mind gets hooked into, the imagination. And then the other is whether we're in control and direction of the picture or Jesus. Diane? Another objection?
People get hung up on creating happy little memories in place of the bad ones and forget about forgiveness.
Okay, so people get hung up on just reliving the bad memories. I find a lot of times when people come into counseling, it's like they're bleeding to death. And so what do they need? They need some bandages. And yes, some of the bandages are fairly self-absorbed and self-introspective. But somewhere along the line, it's like people get to the point of saying, okay, now I've got enough of the bandages, I've got enough of the healing. Now I can start the real process of growth, which is the death to self. But it's a process that happens. And most people that come in are so broken and so hurt and so bleeding, they need someone just to be there as a crutch for them for a while, to help them get things back together again so that they can get to a spot where they and the Lord then can start dealing with some of the issues. And then it's the next step. So yes, then they step out of the self-absorbed introspection and are ready then to start the real process of healing, which the Lord said was dying to self. So that means saying, Lord, I'd rather be angry at somebody, where death to self is no, I'm going to do the forgiveness part like Jesus has told me to do.
Is there a danger?
Another danger?
People who are new to all this going into things about being in an experience, so that is another possible objection.
So, sort of the false imagination, the false memory syndrome, is that what you're headed for?
Someone who's new to the faith sort of practice without supervision.
Okay, well that's about 3 pages down the line. Yes. But that is another objection. Some people think the false, that counseling and the healing of memory stuff brings up a lot of memories that are only half there, and then it's very easy for the counselor to lead them and false memories begin to emerge. And there's been a lot of those probably in years past, not so much I haven't seen this year, but where a woman will come in and say, well, I think something happened between my dad and I, and I've got one hazy little tiny memory, and then the counselor will lead them through a process, and after 5 sessions, they're firmly convinced that they were sexually abused by their dad. Now, sometimes that does happen, and sometimes that's spot on. But sometimes it's a leading of the counselor, and I think that we as counselors have got to be very careful of that, of not building on hazy memories of childhood that can neither be proven nor disproven, and it's just maybe it happened, maybe it didn't. The approach I like to take is that children are so much more spiritually aware than what we think they are, and often a little child being in the same room where a lot of lustful thoughts are happening, and a lot of, the person that's there would like to do something but stops themselves. It's like they're influenced and they pick up some of those vibes, those feelings as well. So they may not have been sexually abused, but they may have been in circumstances where the person that was there would like to have done it, and they felt those feelings coming from that person.
Would that under the heading power of suggestion?
Yes, under the power of suggestion, yes. Yeah, it can be dangerous. And particularly working with people who are hurt and broken, you have to be very careful not to lead them beyond either where the Lord is saying or where they know for certain. Because I'm sure all of us know horror stories where families have been broken up, where a daughter steps in and says, yes, my dad abused me, and there's no real proof, there's only hazy memories. But she's now stepped into an area because her counselor has really encouraged her to go and get her pound of flesh and make dad pay, and when there was no real proof that happened at all. So we have to be careful. Yeah, power of suggestion. Capital C, signs of when inner healing are needed. Number 1, recurring events, memories which interfere with life. So it's like a pattern that just keeps happening, like the lady that I shared with you, where every time she ran into a similar personality, she had a reaction. Her boss, the year 12 teacher, her roommate at university, and her mother. A major sign of trauma is when painful memories continue to emerge through our defenses and interfere with normal living. Reoccurring mental pictures, scenes, or dreams bring disturbance and disrupt our emotional and spiritual life. In other words, they're caught in the ever-present state of being traumatized. And there was a young girl that I was working with that was in all of these case stories, by the way. I've changed enough of the names and the circumstances that you can't say, hey, that's my neighbor next door. So it's all changed around. So all of this is all changed around. So a young girl that came in that was just paranoid about going upstairs. And she just had to really psych herself up really hard in order to go upstairs, particularly ones where you could see through between the runners and the stairs. And so being a good Christian and from a good Pentecostal background, she'd take her 20 scriptural verses and she'd have them in her hand and she'd make herself go up the stairs. But it was harder and harder and harder and harder. So she came in to have a chat about all of this. And the Lord began working with her, and I took her through some heart work, and come to find out her heart felt like she was just beating it over the head to make herself go up the stairs all the time. And her emotions and her heart were just starting to close down. They couldn't take it anymore. So then the Lord began to show her flashbacks of another pair of stairs, and it came what the Lord was showing her, that back when she was 6, she was in her boyfriend's house, her sister's older boyfriend's, it was a very complicated, convoluted story. But anyhow, she was in this house, and the guy that was there babysitting her actually sexually abused her, and she ran for The stairs, that's right. And it was stairs that were open, and so every time she came around those stairs, it was like she was having flashbacks and reliving that experience was coming up and up again. So the reoccurring events were what was beginning to traumatize her again and again and again. So the answer wasn't as good as what the Bible verses can be for us. The answer wasn't to give her the closer the person is and was that hurt us, or the more significant they were, the deeper the hurt, the sense of abandonment and personal rejection. So sometimes inner healing is needed when a person has just a sense of abandonment, of rejection by people. 3, reoccurring sense of shame, guilt, humiliation. 4, continuing horrible thoughts and disabling fears. 5, continued intense emotional reaction, such as hate, anger, or bitterness. And particularly if what they're feeling at the moment isn't the correlation to the amount of anger that they're feeling. So they might feel intense rage when their little child just dropped a piece of bread on the ground. So that the rage that they're feeling is not the same as what the situation warranted it. So deep emotional reactions. And then 6, problems in getting close to God in worship or when spiritual growth seems blocked. Capital D, other comments about inner healing. Other comments about inner healing. Number 1, 3 areas need to be addressed for deep healing. Number 1, the intellectual. Our mind needs a certain amount of information in order to understand the process and be able to compare it with biblical principles. So the mind has to understand what's going on. 2, the heart. The inner areas of our life, including the emotions, where often the roots of the problem are in the heart. The emotions need to be released or healed. And then C, our spirit in the spiritual dimension. As a result of the first 2 changing, the spiritual networks around people will change also. Of course, it can happen vice versa. So in other words, when I've been around a lot of people in inner healing that just said, well, just take your mind. You don't need to understand what's happening here. Just go with the flow. And I find for the continued inner healing process, you need to have all 3 of those areas. So the mind has to understand enough of what's going on to not be fighting the process. Then the heart has to be willing to allow what's happening to keep on happening, to allow the healing to get down deeper and deeper and deeper. Because I'm finding very often that people know a lot about inner healing, a lot about deliverance, a lot about all the Christian stuff up here, but we all know the greatest journey is the 6 inches between here and the heart. And a lot of people know it all up here. They've got it, they could write textbooks on it. But the heart is either unchanged, isn't willing to work on it, has closed down, hasn't come to the party, and wants nothing to do with it. So I find the more I work with heart stuff, the more the mind and the heart have to be in agreement. And most of us in the Western culture are very good at separating our mind and our heart. And we often are taught how to bury our emotions, and so the heart with all of its emotions are off here somewhere, usually far more hurt and shattered and bruised than what we think it is. And our mind sails happily on saying, well, just get on with it. It doesn't work that way, does it? So the mind has to know enough to keep on with what's happening, but the heart needs to be involved in the whole thing too. And I've even had people that the Lord showed them a lot about generational curses, but the heart says, I'm not going there, don't have anything to do with it. So then we have to stop and almost get the heart on side so the heart can trust Jesus in order to allow him to do what he needs to do and all of that. So the 2 have to be together for continued growth. And then when those 2 things are together, the spiritual dimension will begin to change as well. Yep.
With that area of heart,
Yes?
Counselling, have you had many people refuse to go on from there?
People's heart? Yes.
So that's end of story.
Well, not exactly, because often you can say, well, heart, are you willing to let Jesus come and talk to you about that? And then if the heart will let Jesus come and talk to him, usually we can get back on the process. But I've had people that at the end, that close to the middle of the session, the heart says, no, don't want to have anything to do with it. And so we fold up that topic we're working on. I give the person the homework to take away and become friends with their heart, In other words, just to be willing to get some contact there with what's happening in their heart. And then the next week they come back and usually their heart's willing to get into it. Because I find once the heart really does get sold on that Jesus has the answer, and once our heart knows that we are trustworthy, it'll go along with it. But yeah, I often have people who come in. Probably the classic is people that come in and say, I really want to do something for God, I really want to do something for the church, I really want to get in there, but I'm having trouble reading, I'm having trouble worshiping. And then we do some heart work, and the heart says, no, don't want any of it. Don't trust Jesus anymore. Don't think that God knows what he's doing. I don't want anything of it. Thank you very much. And so often that's the case where then we have to start working with the heart. Interesting. I used to think I had all the answers until I got into the heart stuff. And now I know that if the heart's not with us, we aren't going nowhere. And I've often said that to people. And then the emphasis then is to go back and help the heart learn to trust the Lord, learn to let Jesus come in and touch the heart.
As far as that goes, sometimes I even see people going through this for years.
For years?
For years. It's a choice, isn't it?
Yeah. Yes, certainly there's a choice. Hopefully, if the people can learn how to let Jesus come and talk to their heart and take their religion and their Christianity stuff and just set it aside and allow their heart to be real, allow their heart to bring up the emotions that it's feeling, that helps the journey. And I don't know of anybody that's taken that long to be friends with their heart and get their heart back on side. Usually it takes a couple of weeks. And for most people, just the idea that the heart can be in one direction and the mind's in the other direction is pretty amazing.
It seems, though, that a lot of people get into a habit of
Mm-hmm.
comfort,
Mm-hmm.
and they choose that way more often than doing the hard work.
Yes.
And,
Yes.
And as a counsellor, then you can
Yes.
do the counsellor. But first, the counsellor's got to do the doing. You can't do that.
That's true. But it's giving them the tools to learn how to do it. So yes, it's choices. Yeah, that's choices. But I often find that the head wants to make one choice, and then the person as a whole, I'm not trying to split you up into schizophrenic parts in here, but the person as a whole has a choice to make as well. But the heart has a choice. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So our intellect, our heart, and then the spiritual dimension actually changes. Because remember, Paul's key was not so much 10 steps in deliverance, but was to do what? It's to renew the mind. That was Paul's entrance point. So as you renew the mind, and that involves the heart changes as well, then the spiritual dimension will change. Every time you get a little aha experience with the Lord, I think that your spiritual dimension is changed. Because the enemy feeds on the darkness, stays there in the darkness and the half-truth. So every time you get truth that goes down into your heart, something changes in the spiritual dimension. 2, a word of caution. And this is where you were, David. People working in inner healing must have a good knowledge of how repression and denial allow survival of life's pains. The pain may come to the surface, all right, but what does the person do with their pain then? So only allow qualified people to work on your issues, especially in the areas of inner healing and heart work. Ripping away these defenses and exposing the heart's pain without giving them more effective ways of coping will only make the pain worse. So be very careful if you're working in this area, if either you're leading someone through this area or you're facing it yourself. Because I have worked with people where, Susan wasn't very wise in ripping off some of the bandages, and here was all this blubbering pain. And now what do we do with it? And I'm glad we've got Jesus in it. I certainly wouldn't be doing it if I were a secular counselor, because Jesus is the only one that can bring the healing, the comfort, the peace that brings the healing in all of this. So be careful in this area.
Well, the whole thing is, Susan, the person can feel like they're going backwards anyway, because
Mm-hmm.
they've had all this denial. Or
Yes,
maybe
the
they've got
denial.
a counsellor who's worked in the mind area,
Yes.
and they use that, and suddenly up comes all this pain from their heart. And
Yes.
My goodness, I'm getting worse before I get better.
Mm-hmm.
And better all.
Yes.
That's scary.
Yes, I find that people that have come from a very logical-orientated counselor that's taught them lots of really fantastic stuff, and they know a lot about assertion, assertive statements. They know a lot about conflict resolution. They know a lot about boundaries. They know a lot about, this huge long list. And so in they come for some counseling because they just can't quite get that last little tiny bit of their healing. And here they're exposed to the heart work, and they find that their heart is a shattered mess ready for intensive care. Yeah, it's a bit traumatic. Yes, and I've had that happen. Particularly people that have been in the church scene for a long, long time, and they think they know a lot about it, and they certainly do, but they have no awareness of where their heart is. So yes, you have to be careful that way, because they could feel like they've just slid all the way back downhill. And if they're the kind then that throws the baby out with the bathwater, they'll say, well, I didn't do anything with the Lord anyhow, and I guess I just have to start all over, and it's so hopeless, and I just want to go out and do whatever. So yes. So learning how to assure the person that they've got a lot of mind stuff up here, and the Lord's going to use all that mind stuff, but we've got to get down and bring the healing to the heart so that the two together then can go whoopee.
In the church, we are taught that our house is meant to be pure, it's meant to be pure, but purity also means honesty.
Yes.
So it's honesty with our feelings.
Yes. That's true. And a lot of us, our emotions are big no-no areas to go anyhow. But honesty with our feelings, yes. Yes. And to me, the emotions are the messengers that your heart sends out of how you're feeling. And so if you get the paper boy knocking at your door for the payment of the bill, you don't shoot the paper boy. You take the bill and you do something with it. So we need to learn that our emotions are messengers. So our emotions aren't good or bad. It's what we do with them that makes them right or wrong. But the emotions are messengers. So if I'm feeling a lot of frustration and annoyance about Daniel, then it's my heart is feeling annoyance and frustration. So heart, okay, what's up here? Jesus, what's happening in here? Come and talk to me about what's happening here with Daniel and I. So the emotions are messengers. And emotions themselves can't hurt us. They're not very pleasant sometimes, but they can't hurt us. Good point. Capital E, conclusion. Hidden half-truths and lies keep ungodly reactions bubbling in our heart. If the heart is too injured or caught up in false beliefs, then we will find it very difficult to change the reactions. Jesus is the truth and knows the truth of our heart. By allowing him access to our heart, we can find wholeness. If we can identify our memories, reactions, emotions, or thinking patterns, then we can find the heart's half-truth and get healed. Remember, we talked about this before. If you're trying to change your behavior, what do you have to look at? Yep, which is your what? Your emotions. So if you want to find out what's wrong with what's happening with your emotions and your behavior, you look at the thinking process that's going on. And if you want to find out why you do what you do, why you have the emotions you do, why you think the way that you do, you look at the heart. That's right. So if you want to change behavior, you can go out and learn 15 different ways to behave different. But if you haven't changed your thinking process, it's not going to last very long. So for effective change in behavior, you have to change the thinking process, know why you react the way that you react, and all of that comes out of the heart. This is part of the Psychology of Jesus unit for those of you that didn't know the right answers. Okay. In a nutshell, inner healing is allowing Jesus to expose the hidden half-truths and deal with the damaged emotions or memories we have repressed or denied. As the living Jesus touches, heals, and forgives, we find a release at whatever stuck point or points we have experienced. This is part of our journey of life, is what he came for, what he died for, and what he wants to give healing for as we walk with him. It's up to us to accept his lordship in the area of damaged emotions as well. Now, before we go on to curses, first one, capital D, other comments about inner healing?
3 areas need to address.
For deep healing. Turn over to page... Oh, that's interesting. Daniel's put it in the workshop. Do you have the last page? No, page 10. Beg your pardon. Page 10, Appendix A, Steps for the Inner Healing Journey. Page 10. Now, these are the 7 major steps when you're working through inner healing. And again, it's not a tick sheet where you go through step 1, tick, step 2, tick, step 3, tick. Because often the Lord takes, like, for example, step 1, and He might do quite a few things in that area that are not on my list that you need to do. So these are the 7 sort of basic touch points as you go through working in inner healing. Number 1, to discover the painful emotions in your heart. So often for people, when they want to start in on inner healing, the emotions are a good place to start because it's like the emotions are the window into your heart. So whenever you're feeling a strong emotion, that's a chance to start working on what's the problem in there. So emotions are one place you can start. Actually, there's about 7 different places you can start, but emotions probably are the most common that you get people coming into, particularly into counseling. They might say, I feel a lot of anger about my mother, and so that's the issue they want to work on. Of course, they want the magic solution so they don't feel any anger anymore, but they don't have to work on their heart issues. Doesn't work that way, does it? So, discover the painful emotions in your heart. First step in getting healed of stuck emotions in your heart is to look for the reaction cycles that cause the emotions that you feel. For some people, the emotions come before any awareness of reaction cycles. Now, before we go any further on this, I want you to do just a little bit of a practical thing. I want you just to check inside before we begin. Always check to see if your heart's willing to work. So just take a minute. If you need to close your eyes, I want you to check to see if your heart's understanding what we're talking about. Is your heart understanding what we're talking about? Okay, now if you had a little problem doing that, it probably needs you need to do some heart work. Because often we can start going through this logically, and the mind says, yep, go for it, understand, tick, 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 I'm with you, Susan. But then we just go a little bit deeper, and the heart might be saying, well, I'm a little bit painful in here. It's like I'm getting hurt a little bit in talking about these things. And so the heart might say, I think I'd rather just go think about what I had for dinner tonight, or what am I going to do when I get home, or, oh, I hope it's nice weather tomorrow, I can get out in the garden. And at that point, it's like your heart just closes down on the whole thing. So when you're doing inner healing stuff, always check and make sure your heart's with us. Now, if there's anybody whose heart had a violent reaction and you'd like to just go visit the little boy's room or the little girl's room, please feel free to go. But we'll keep on going here. Number 2, express the emotions. So let's go back. We use the example of the lady that came in and said that I'm having trouble with my boss. We'll use that as an example because we've already talked about that one. So she came in to talk to me about her boss. So number 1, what were the painful emotions she was feeling? Give me just half a dozen of them you think might have been there. Anger. What else? Fear. Frustration. Oh, you betcha, lots of frustration because she'd tried 10 different things and none of them worked. What else? Rejection. She could have been feeling some rejection that her boss didn't want anything to do with her, that she wasn't good enough. Her self-esteem was being affected. Yes, so she was starting to have some doubts of, I get along with everybody else in my office, but how come I can't do with this one? There must be something wrong with me. So her self-confidence was getting shaken, yes. She was beginning to feel a little bit insecure that, the boss had the power over her to hire and fire, so she was feeling a little insecure. So those were the emotions. Those were probably the most common ones. Those were the emotions. So the second step is for her to express these emotions. So she needs to get in touch with them enough that they aren't just logical concepts of, yes, this is anger. Next, aim to put these emotions into words. Sometimes it helps to use a pain scale to express the right intensity and then list the name for the emotions. So if she gave me 10 emotions, I'd probably say now, okay, what's the top 3 emotions that are the most painful? On a scale of 1 to 10, where's the most painful emotions in there? And she might say, insecurity, what else might she say? Frustration and annoyance. She might say, those are my 3 top emotions. So the other stuff were maybe 7, 6, 4, somewhere in there. But the 3 top emotions. Explore your emotions until you get as near 10 out of 10 for the capacity as possible. Work on the fear if you need it. Remember, feelings themselves cannot hurt you. In fact, the only way your heart can be liberated from the hurt in there is to express the emotions. If you have trouble verbalizing your feelings, then you need to learn how. Then number 3, allow the emotions to take you to the injury site. So the 3 top emotions, you'd say, okay, I want you to ask the Lord to let those 3 top emotions take you back to the time when you felt the same way. And it's amazing. It's like they'll get this video recorder going in their mind, and they'll see various glimpses of times when they felt the same emotion but not as near intensity. And pretty soon the Lord will bring them back to one point in their life where they felt the intensity of those 3 emotions together. Once you've identified the feelings, ask Jesus to follow the trail of the feelings to the memory of the childhood trauma. Invite the Lord into the memory. If you have experienced problems here, sometimes it helps to see yourself at your present age, talking with the little you going through the trauma. And that's what people talk about when they talk about working on little girl, little boy issues, is you at your age, you're talking to the person back there at whatever trauma age they were at. The aim is to hear what the Lord's saying about the event and understand His perspective. So, for example, I really can't remember what the event was, so I'll just make up one to further confuse everything as well. We could say the woman in the office, okay, she remembered a time back when she was 6 years old and she was going to school for her first day. Now, how many people know that that can be one of the most traumatic events in a person's life? It's going to school, 6 years old, for the very first time in your life. And she could remember standing at the school gate and feeling those 3 emotions. And what did Mom do? What do you reckon Mom would have done? Just said, bye-bye, you'll be a good big girl. I'll pick you up at 3 o'clock tonight and you'll be all right. And the annoyance, the irritation because Mom wouldn't stop and listen, and the anger that was there, the insecurity that was there. 4, let Jesus expose the lie that you believe. So the reason that something gets stuck there that's a traumatic event that our mind still hangs on to is because somewhere in there we believed a half-truth about ourselves. So when you've drifted to the childhood trauma memory, Jesus will want to meet you there for inner healing. Because Jesus is the truth, ask Him to expose the lie in your heart that your heart has believed all these years. Give me some idea of what kind of lie that little girl may have believed about herself. Nobody loved me. That's right. What else? Mom didn't want me. What else? I have to be really good all the time and do the right thing because if I'm not, Mom won't like me anymore or I'll get in trouble. So I have to be really good on my first day at school and I have to hold it together really, really well. And I can't cry and I can't do anything that's going to let everybody know I'm hurting inside. Yep. Or the opposite, it's no good crying about anything because nobody's going to listen anyhow. So another layer of concrete just went over her emotions. What else might she have believed? Maybe Mom's going to abandon me. She's never going to come back and get me. Yeah, so all kinds of little lies get planted at that point. And it's because the heart believed those little lies that it's stuck there. And so because Jesus is the truth, we ask Jesus to bring the truth to that little girl. And what might be some of the truth that Jesus would have said to her. That He loves her and that He was right there for her. Yes? What else? That she could talk to Him, that He will listen, that it's all right to be a little girl and cry, and that even big girls cry and it's still all right.
That her mum had her own issues that she needed to deal with, and therefore she was reacting to her own thoughts.
Yes, so Mom would have had her own issues, and because Jesus is talking to the big grown-up 30-year-old, the 30-year-old might say, yeah, I can remember Mom was going through a divorce at that time. My dad had just left, so yeah, my mom would have had big issues for herself that she had to go through and had to work through. So I guess, yeah, heart, I guess we can forgive her. So it's letting Jesus come back and talk to the heart about what lie it believed, and that's what brings the freedom, the liberation. Have Jesus give you the Rhema truth. As he speaks to you in a vision or by words, it will have an impact on your spirit. Not only will the lie be exposed, but also he will give you the aha Rhema that can be accepted by your heart. Hearing his truth will change your inner heart belief about why God allowed the trauma. And then introduce the little one to your best friend possible, to Jesus. And spend time and allow him to touch, heal, and to love you. And I find often that's a really healing experience, is the older person, the 30-year-old that's there in the picture, introduces the little girl to her best friend and to Jesus. And the two of them will sit and talk, or Jesus will take her off and play on the playground, or take her over where the other little children are, and everything will be much, much more peaceful. The trauma won't be there so much. So the aim is to get Jesus in there as much as possible. Then 8, seal the healing through forgiveness. When Jesus has healed you, there is no more pain. Your heart can really forgive the abuser from the heart. This means taking your judgment off of them, setting them free to the choice of their will, and releasing them to God's justice. So if this little girl at that point could say, yeah, Mom did have a lot of her own issues, so I can forgive her, I can let Jesus heal me and work it through, then that's sealing it with forgiveness. And because she's seen the Rhema truth, she can take her judgment off of her mom, and that anger, that bitterness in there that she had toward mother will begin to get less and less and less. Mm-hmm.
Will you always understand why God allowed the trauma at that point?
Well, there's always the exception to the rule. Spending time with the Lord to get it down to that depth. Sometimes God will come and show you, sometimes not, because it's a bigger picture. In some ways, I think I've said this before, but we know so little about the spiritual dimension. He only shows us what we can understand at the point. Now, sometimes God will come and show you, like, for example, if the Lord came and talked to the little girl about her mother and going through her own divorce problems and mother's issues, that'll give a bit more clarity as to why. Because the Lord may have been putting the pressure on so Dad would come to the Lord.
If there's healing, you may not need to know the reason of it about it.
That's true. When there's healing, you may not always need to know the reason why. Yeah. And some of it, our heart's looking for the deeper reasons why anyhow. Why did God allow that to happen to start with? And that's a bit of a journey. I think particularly people that have gone through a lot of abuse, need to find their own answer for that. Because it's too easy to be very logical and say, well, God allowed that to happen because A, B, C, D, E, F. And we can give some good theological answers, which are all true, but the heart might say, no, none of that fits. Why, God, why did you leave me on that? And number 7, work through any related issues. Sometimes ungodly soul ties must be broken, especially if there was a sexual sin involved. Breaking generational curses, word curses, applying forgiveness and releasing others may be required. Then forgiveness of oneself is also important. I find for a lot of people it's easy to forgive, fairly easy to understand that God forgives them and they can accept that. And they can understand that other people will forgive them. But the hardest point is to forgive themselves. A lot of people get stuck there. They accept God's forgiveness, other people's forgiveness, but they have trouble forgiving themselves. So that means another round of heart work on self-esteem stuff. Okay, any last-minute comments on that before we take a break? Yep.
When you're talking about this example that when she was at school, she might felt abandonment.
Mm-hmm.
When you're dealing with the heart, just say if there's anger, just say if there's demonic activities,
Yes.
spirits of anger, frustration,
Mm-hmm.
deal with that as well, like finding and denying it to leave, or
It depends on the person, depends on how spiritually aware they are, because once the truth starts getting in there, it's like the stronghold starts splitting apart anyhow, and the enemy begins to lose his base. Some people, yes, I've carried it on. Some people, even as the little girl, they can see shadows of things hanging around the little girl, and we'll talk a little bit about that one and some examples on the curses. If a person can do that, then yes, I step into that, because it brings an added awareness of the demonic realm. But a lot of times when the healing actually happens, the whole thing begins to fall apart anyhow. So if Jesus says to do, yes, we do. But if he doesn't, I don't. So it's sort of like what we talked about before. If I throw all my food scraps out in the backyard and I attract the rats, can I get rid of the rats? Yeah, I can get rid of the rats. I can go out and trap them. I can do all kinds of things. But will it keep them away? No. It's getting rid of the rubbish. And most of the time it's those hurt areas in our heart that are the rubbish tip, where the enemy has legal rights to be there. And that's where the anger gets stirred up, because it's like the bruise that's in there. He knows it's there. So getting the healing in is getting rid of the rubbish tip. Okay? And before we dive into it, I've got a lot of really good material from this book. Now, I'm told that this is an older version of a more modern update one that Derek Prince has done on blessing and cursing. He's probably the best author that's worked in this area. He's done a lot of years of research in the Old Testament and the New Testament, putting it all together. So I'd highly recommend this book. But I hear the new one has a bit different color. So Derek Prince, Blessing or Curse, you can choose. Highly recommend some of his material. Derek Prince, Blessing or Curse, you can choose. And it won't look like this in the bookshop because there's some newer ones out than this. Okay, number 2 that we're going to talk about tonight is curses. So, biggest question of all, capital A, what is a curse? Ever hear someone say, it just runs in my family? Their comment may have been made in jest, but the truth may be more real than they know. The topic of curses is another pseudo-Christian area. Even secular counselors recognize the strong patterns of such traits. Secular counselors might use words such as the tendency toward, an inherent or genetic trait, or a predisposition towards something. So if you go to a secular counselor and say, well, they've got a predisposition toward alcoholism, the Bible would talk about that's the possibility of a generational curse. So a predisposition toward. All families have certain patterns that are evident in their members. These patterns can be the physical characteristics, illnesses, conditions, and disorders, as well as the psychological traits, the attitudes, the habits that are found within the family. Now, some of these are blessings, and some of these are what's called a curse. We need to understand what the Bible means by a curse if we're to help discover the network that holds us captives. So whenever you're working in this area, you need to be aware that there are blessings that come down through the generations as well as a curse that can come down through the generations. Most of us can think of the blessings that are over our life right now, and sometimes those blessings are because we had godly grandparents or parents that prayed for us, and then the blessing can keep coming into our life. Sometimes it's a generational thing where ancestors in previous generations have worked really, really hard, and so there's a fair degree of wealth in the culture. So Australia has been a blessed nation. There's been some really hard work by people in the past, and some of those people were very godly people, and that blessing has come down through the generations, as well as some of the not so nice things that have come down. Number 1, the results of our actions bring a blessing or a curse. The results of our actions bring a blessing or a curse. And I think yours says are a blessing or a curse. So the results of the actions. The first mention of a curse is found in Genesis 3:16-19, where Adam and Eve disobeyed God and were escorted out of the Garden of Eden. That's a polite way of putting it. Yes. I'm sure it was a very sad, sorrowful father who pronounced the results of their disobedience, not an angry God who said, I'll teach you to break my commands. So when we work in this area of a curse, it's not because it's a God up in the sky that's got this big stick and he whacks us over the head whenever we sin. The angry father figure, that's not the way it is. Curses are the natural consequences of what we do or our family does or our ancestors have done. It's a natural consequence of some sin. 2, breaking God's law brings irrevocable results. Irrevocable results. A curse is an unbreakable or unstoppable result where some sin is committed. It's the consequences that follow when unrecognized or unrepentant actions by others or ourselves have offended God. And there's a little box there that I wanted to draw a picture of it before Daniel got a chance to run it off, and I didn't quite get to. So the picture that you need to draw in there, it's like two chain links stuck together. So it's the event and the consequences that are so stuck together they can't be separated. So however you can draw it, but it's like two chain links that are stuck together. Now that makes it a curse because you've got the sin, whatever that was that the person did, and the consequences are so stuck together that only something supernatural can break the consequences from the sin that happened. Everybody with me on that so far? Mm-hmm. So it's the irrevocable results of somebody's sin. Some sins are so destructive and deadly, God made a list of the top 10 to avoid, and he called these the 10 Commandments. 3, a curse allows God to bring judgment. A curse allows God to bring judgment. It's important to remember that curses are one of the main ways that God brings judgment on the rebellious and the ungodly. His remedy is also clear, to hear and obey his voice. Satan is allowed to carry out the consequences of the sin and the disobedience. So some sins are just so horrible in a sense that they're on God's hit list, that they bring such a consequence that he put all the top 10 together, and that's what we call the 10 Commandments. Because in breaking every single one of those 10 brings irrevocable damage, irrevocable consequences of those actions, and it brings it into our life. So for example, one of the 10 Commandments is not to commit adultery. When adultery happens, what's some of the consequences? What can be some of the consequences? A woman can fall pregnant, yes, so there's an unwanted pregnancy. Yeah, what else? Soul ties, broken relationships. The whole family's torn apart when they found out what mom did, so relationships are broken all over the place. So the results of the sin of adultery is so horrific and so horrible. Some of those things, that's the consequences of the sin, and you can't stop the consequences from happening once the sin's been committed. 4, a curse is spiritually reinforced. Spiritually reinforced. Satan and his forces bring the penalty when sin and iniquity have been committed against others and against God. The enemy is allowed to act as he has been given a legal right to interfere when sin breaks unity with God. If deliverance doesn't work, check out whether there's a curse operating. For more details, see Bill Zabritsky's list on how to break a curse, Appendix A. You can tell that one was one that Daniel did. He did a unit called Why Our Problems Control Us. And one of the things he put in there was how to break curses. Now, I've taken some of that and put it over on Appendix B, Breaking Curses, some general principles. And we'll talk about those in a minute. So flip back over to where we were. Number 5, the importance of being accountable. Accountable. In counseling for abuse, one of the main healing events takes place when someone takes accountability for the pain that they've caused. When Cain killed Abel in Genesis 4:18, Cain did not acknowledge his guilt, but Abel's blood called out to God in verse 10. God then intervened and forced Cain to acknowledge his guilt and by pronouncing a curse over him. So, often in particularly in abuse cases, if dad can confess up to his daughter and say, yes, I did do those things, please forgive me, it brings an incredible amount of healing when someone takes accountability for the sin that's happened. So sometimes when a curse has been pronounced as a consequence of their action, it's like God is asking someone to take accountability for what's been happening, for what sin has been caused. Because when that doesn't happen, it's like Satan has that open door to bring the effect, the damage into people's lives. Because it isn't God that brings the penalty, it's Satan that brings the penalty. In Leviticus 26:40, God calls for someone to take accountability for the sin committed against him. Someone has to acknowledge their disobedience and the resulting consequences. Someone needs to care enough to say, enough is enough. And sometimes that's the basic principles, one of the basic principles in dealing with a curse. Is someone in this present day and age saying, yep, Lord, my grandmother was into witchcraft and she caused a lot of damage. She hurt a lot of people in that. And Lord, I'm sorry she did that. So I'm standing here saying enough is enough. And Lord, I'm asking you to forgive our generation. So it's like I'm taking the accountability for something that my ancestor did. Any questions on that? Everybody with me? I can see the wheels going round. All right, capital B. How do we pick up a curse? How do we pick up a curse? Number one, no curse can activate without a cause. No curse can activate without a cause. It's important to remember that a curse without a cause shall not alight. Proverbs 26:2. We must somehow turn on the curse to receive it ourselves. Everybody understand that? So just because there's a huge line of curses over my mother does not mean that I automatically step into that. I must do something that activates that stuff that was over her. I make some choice along the line to do the same thing, or if I hold such anger and bitterness and hatred toward her, that can activate some of the curses as well. So there needs to be some sort of tie there in order for me to step into curses. So that means, number one, a curse cannot take effect unless there is some cause. It also means that where there's a curse at work, there must also be a cause. And that, so those two are hooked together. All right? So when you know that there's a curse over your family, you need to find out what the cause is, because the curse will always have a cause will always have a curse. An example is Debbie's story about a lemon tree. There's another young woman that I worked with that can remember back when she was 6 years old, her parents went through a very, very messy, traumatic divorce. And she used to go outside in the backyard and sit under the lemon tree. And she can remember very vividly the memories of the little girl sitting there, getting her peace, getting her security, getting her comfort by sitting under the lemon tree. However, as she looks back now, she sees that it was not Jesus she was in contact with. What was it? Well, if it's not Jesus, what's it got to be? Yeah, it was the demonic world. She says she can still remember the feelings of little flitty things around her, and that she started calling them fairies. And so when she was 16, she really got into fairies. Now, they weren't fairies in a sense of little Cinderella, Walt Disney things flying around. What were they? Actually, demonic entities. And so she, back as that little child, began to talk to these little flitty things. What was she talking to? She was talking to the demonic. And she got her comfort from there. So what was she doing? Oh dear. She was pretty amazed when the Lord began opening her eyes and showing her that she had touched the demonic realm and that her heart had made a friend. She had spirit guides. She actually had demonic helpers that taught her how to do certain things, such as, protect her heart from getting hurt. And so she actually was dabbling in the occult and didn't even realize it. And it's not until the Lord began showing her what she really was in contact with that she could see that because of that, that was the reason why it seemed like every 5 years she would just fall into the hole again. That she'd get really up and going and really doing well, and then something would come along. It was like the enemy just pulled the rug out from under her feet when she was functioning really well. And the Lord showed her that's exactly what had happened. That she was back in contact with the demonic realm, and that had followed her ever since. And that had been a big legal right in her life, that whenever she would get fairly functional, fairly stable, was like along the enemy would come and just pull the rug out from under her feet because he had a legal right to do that. So that was pretty amazing. That's been a, that's been one of those questions that I've used with quite a few people. So what did your heart turn to when you were a little child for comfort? Because unless it was the Lord, it's probably still there. Ouch. So, that's Debbie's story of the lemon tree. 2, the enemy has some legal right to attack us. A legal right to attack us. There are some activities we have knowingly participated in that open the door to a curse. So these are knowingly things that we've done with a deliberate choice, such as abortion, oppression and injustice against the weak and the helpless, cursing God's chosen people, willingly passing the point of no return by continuing known addictions. That one I usually get a bit of a question. There's a point where if you're working on an issue with the Lord and you know that it's an addiction, for example, what might be a good one? We always pick on chocolate. We'll pick on chocolate again. There might be a point in your life when you know God is saying, no more chocolate, that's your limit. And then if I knowingly go out and take another piece, 2, 3, 4 pieces, it's like I've crossed that line. And that's knowingly I've fed back into the addiction, and then I've activated the whole thing all over again. So it's like passing the point of no return. When you know there's a weakness there, when you know there's addiction, and you just yielded to it and you get back into the cycle again. Some alternative health practices, disrespect for parents, pledges and oaths to join false religions and cults, such as the Freemasons or some of the other cults around have pledges. Illicit, unnatural, immoral sexual acts, having demonic objects or entering demonic buildings, involved with the occult, pornography, theft, perjury, self-imposed curses, ungodly soul ties, violence, and horror movies. It's interesting, I worked with another young girl that as her comfort in her childhood, she used to watch horror movies. And don't ask me how you could ever watch horror movies of comfort. I have no idea. But she was really hooked into a lot of the Dracula vampire movies. And that's where her comfort was. So whenever she got really super stressed, she'd go in and read her occult book and look through the occult, the vampires and the witches and the Draculas stuff. So that's exactly how the enemy got her. So horror movies. Now some activities and events that bring a curse are involuntary. In other words, you didn't choose to do that. Ancestral generational sin, inherited curses, addictions, when you've lost control. Notice when the will has been so tangled that the person has no more willpower. It's like they've lost control. Fears, phobias, miscarriages, trauma, emotional crisis, such as car accidents, going to the hospital, those sort of trauma, emotional crisis, false words and beliefs spoken over you, and witnessing violence. So any one of those events can also bring demonic activity in a person's life.
What do you mean by false religion?
Word curses, or it could be like going through sexual ritual abuse when someone goes through a chant, counterfeit, just the authority in that person's life speaks certain things into being, or voodoo curses or things like that.
Excuse me, sorry.
Mm-hmm.
Witnessing violence, I mean, just watching the news, you can do that.
Just watching the news, you can witness violence. That's true. And I think that's why some of the newscasters have started putting that little disclaimer at the beginning of it, or the little statement that watching this may cause distress for some people. But yes, that's more like if you're walking down the shopping center and you run into an armed holdup and there's a lot of blood and violence and all of that. You didn't choose to be there. You didn't choose to be involved with it. Yeah. Any other comments? 3, our ancestors can give a curse tendency. Some ancestral and inherited curses affect us because someone in our family line has given the enemy a right to repeat the consequences of that sin onto the next, and sometimes many generations. Some activities God hates so much that it's considered a personal affront to him, and he's pronounced curses upon unborn generations. An example of this, number one, ancestors involved in witchcraft or occult activities. We worked with a 16-year-old, this would be going back about 10 years ago, and she had, her arm was frozen. In fact, she showed us that she'd had lots of operations on her elbow, but she could not stretch her arm out. It was just permanently locked. And so we began praying with her and going through some of the curses over her family line. And the Lord showed her a picture of a woman sitting there actually breaking, getting blood from her own finger that she was going to use in some witchcraft activities. And Tracy said, in fact, that's the picture of the woman and they had up all the ancestors, one of the down through the generations pictures, and it was her great-grandmother, was exactly what the Lord had showed her, that she'd been involved in some occult activity. And she went and brought the picture and brought it back and said, yes, this is my great-grandmother. It's the one the Lord had just shown me. So her great-grandmother actually getting her own blood to participate in some sort of, the mind boggles at some of this. Maybe it's better we all hopefully are a little bit innocent in this area. But using her own blood in some sort of witchcraft activity had brought a curse on her whole family. And one of the results of that curse was Tracy's problems that she had with her arm. So we prayed over, and it was probably one of the most amazing miracles that I've ever seen, because she just went like that after the prayer. And it was basically because she took accountability for her great-grandmother and the sin that had brought, and the horrible consequences that had brought on her family. And she asked God to forgive her family line, for being involved in that ancestor stuff and the occult. And she had her healing, and that was just amazing. Probably one of the most amazing miracles that Daniel and I had ever seen. But that was tied up with witchcraft and the curse over her family line. Now, sometimes national iniquities and traditions have to be dealt with. The German, Dutch pride and arrogance, the Australian apathy, rebellion to authority, British snobbery, the American independence, rebellion, insistence on rights, emphasis on looks, Chinese veneration of the elderly, of their tradition, and so on and so on and so on. So sometimes there's some cultural curses that have come down through the generation because we're tied into any one of those. Sorry? Holding them in very high esteem, even more important than God. All right, now if this is an area that, if your family is from a particularly notable national, traditional sort of aspect, this is a good area to pray through. I suppose since I speak with an American accent, I can talk about the rebellion that the Americans were into. The independence, the breaking away from authority. And we celebrate it on July 4th. And that was rebellion to authority, as well as independence and rights against England and all that stuff. But it was a rebellion that happened. So that's all woven into the American culture, into the American identity. But some of it is not a godly independence, it's not a godly rebellion against authority. And so that has to be prayed through. Daniel tells the story about his Germanic background, because his dad was from Prussia. So he had to pray through a lot of the German identity, the cultural stuff that's come down through the generations, the arrogance, the pride, the mind control sort of stuff that was through the German culture. So sometimes that's important. Then also the curses can come down through idolatry, immorality, disloyalty. A curse can also involve verbal abuse, a word spoken against someone. So someone in a God-given authority speaks, such as a teacher saying to a student, "You'll never amount to anything." A voodoo curse that's believed has power to kill if the heart is open to that person. The person speaking has sinned in a way that energizes or allows the enemy to fulfill the curse. Faith-filled words can create things supernaturally. Remember, God created the universe with a spoken word. The tongue has the power of life and death, and those who love it eat its fruit. So words have incredible power, especially from someone in authority spoken over someone. Capital C, how do we recognize a curse? Curses can be discerned by the spirit or by the natural, or in the natural by looking for repeated patterns of bondages or illnesses. If heart attacks run in the family line, it probably has something to do with a curse. If someone can't stop drinking after repentance, delivering, and disciplining the self, it also may be a curse. Derek Prince, in his book Blessings or Curse You Choose, describes 6 blessings and 6 related curses. So as we work through the curses of this, just have a check through your own family line or in your own life. So the curses: humiliation, barrenness, unfruitfulness, poverty, defeat, mental, physical sickness, family breakdowns, oppression, and failure and God's disfavor. Blessings: exaltation, good physical, emotional health, fruitfulness, reproductiveness in life, prosperity, victory, and God's favor. So those are 6 signs of God's blessings on a person's life. And the opposite then is the curses that can be coming down that touch your life. Derek Prince continues further: 7 indicators of a curse. Mental and or emotional breakdowns. Repeated or chronic sicknesses, especially if it's inherited. Female problems, barrenness, miscarriage, menstruation, or related female problems. Breakdown of marriage, family alienation, separation, divorces. Continuing financial insufficiency, poverty, especially if the income is adequate. We worked with a couple that came in and said they're always behind on their bills. She was afraid of going in to cash a check because she was always just concerned of whether there was enough money in the account to get groceries. And she told us what her husband's income was, and it was almost 3 times a teacher's wage for where Daniel and I were back there. And they were always on the poverty line, just always behind on their bills. So poverty, especially if the income's adequate, but they just can't get up on top of things. Being accident prone, history of suicides, unnatural or untimely deaths. And those would probably be the 7 major indicators of a curse is working in your life or in your family's life. The enemy uses curses to control and limit our personal growth. A curse can stunt our personality, our emotional health, and our God-given identity. It can wreck our future or God-given gifts and talents, even our marriage and our relationships with others. Capital D, the many sources of curses. So where does the curse come from? Sources of the curse. Well, first of all, God himself blesses or curses. Secondly, all occult activities bring a curse, as contact with satanic power source brings consequences. 3, people who say they speak on behalf of God. People in positions of authority can curse by their judgments and their words. 5, self-imposed curses like inner vows, heart ties, binding oneself to unscriptural covenants. 6, curses from servants of Satan, such as witch doctors or covens. That's a big one in sometimes around certain areas in Melbourne, around Belgrave. A lot of satanic activity in witches' covens, where they actually target families, target pastors, target people doing God's work, and begin to pray against them. 7, object in our home associated with superstition, idolatrous worship, false religion, or occult practices. 7, all forms of illicit or unnatural sex, incest, and abuse, perversion, and sexual ritual abuses. Those are all things that bring a curse into our lives. E, how to deal with curses. Freedom from a curse revolves around one single, unique historical event, the sacrificial death of Jesus Christ on the cross. The effects of this event extend far beyond his time and throughout history into the timeless future. For by one offering, he, Jesus, has perfected forever those who are being sanctified. It was God's plan to bring all the guilt, suffering of humanity into one climactic moment of release, accomplishing through Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. Breaking any curse over our life is like exchanging our debt for his gift, our sin for his wholeness. Jesus took on a horrible death, the curse of dying on a cross, so that we might take on his blessings. It's an exchange. My unrighteousness for his rightness with God. Galatians 3:13 and 14, Christ has redeemed us from the curse of the law, for it is written, cursed is anyone who hangs on a tree, that the blessings of Abraham might come on the Gentiles through Jesus Christ. And then there are a few other verses you can add up there too. So God chose to have Jesus die on the most cursed death there was possible. Jesus could have been slain with the sword. He could have had his head chopped off. He could have died any number of other ways that the Romans executed their prisoners. But they reserved the hanging on the cross, dying on the tree, for the most horrible of convicts, the ones who had so damaged the society, had so committed such horrible, horrible crimes. This was their way of saying that the most horrible criminals automatically set free from every personal curse when we are born again. We must bridge the past with the person who brought our release, and that's Jesus. Now, one other question that we didn't get a chance to put in here, but we touched on it, I think, the first one or two sessions when Daniel was talking about it, how everybody is held accountable for their own sins. I think, well, do we still have any more questions on that? Because I think Daniel answered that. Do we have any other questions on that? Because I think what God was saying, that no longer would he wipe out whole generations because of one person's sin. Like when David did what he did, thousands of innocent lives were lost. His own son paid the price for David's adultery. And I think what God was saying, that from now on each person will stand acquitted or guilty and can take their own actions and bring their own freedom. Certainly in Jesus that applies to us today. So we each one stand before God for our own self. And particularly when we get information on curses and inherited stuff, we now can say, well, Jesus, is there anything in my life that's brought a curse into my life? And how do you want me to deal with it? Now, before we go on to conclusions, jump over to page 11. We're not going to get a whole lot of time to go too far into this. These are the general principles when you're working with curses. Number 1, be accountable to a holy God for offending him. So all sin offends God, but some are more horrible, worse sins than other sins. Involvement with the occult, not only is that an affront to God because it's denying him, the creator, loving Father that he wants to be in our life, but it's actually touching something else that's a counterfeit, that's proven not good for our lives. So we willingly choose. So be accountable to God for offending him in the sin. Forgive those responsible. The bare minimum is to work through this prayer for your parents and deal with any personal judgments. There are some ministries around that do generational curses back through the 5th, 6th, 10th, even back to the 20th generation. And for some people that's needed to happen, particularly for a really hard core family generational sin that comes down. But the bare minimum, each one of us needs to make sure that we've broken any generational ties between our parents and ourselves. Because if it comes down, it's like a rope. It comes down through the generation. How does it get to my life? Through my parents. So at the bare minimum, I need to make sure that I've cut any ungodly stuff between me and my parents, my father and my mother. And if I've done that and done it to the depth that Jesus wants it to be done to, then sometimes we don't have to deal with generational 5th, 6th, 7th generation stuff back. But it means do it to the bare minimum is to make sure you've done it between you and your parents. Just any ungodly soul ties and any generational curses that's come down. But again, remember, you can't do it just logically. You have to keep what involved? Your heart involved too.
On the spouse's behalf, even if your spouse is unsaved.
Good point. Sometimes you have to deal with spouse's stuff because you can get yourself cleaned up and all you have to do is go back and sleep with your wife or your husband and you're just got the stuff all back in again, which makes it really hard for Christian women to work through some of this stuff, or Christian husbands to work through this stuff if they're unequally yoked.
Are you saying that if a Christian woman's really walking with Jesus, the moment she sleeps with her husband and has sex, that she's got the whole day long all over again?
But for the grace of the Lord, yes. Yes, please. Let's go with the grace of the Lord. No, some of it's to be aware of what stuff is there in the husband and to have prayed through it enough that we can say, okay, that's your stuff, and I've broken it as much as I can, and Lord, keep me protected in all of this. But sexual ties is probably one of the top two ways that the enemy gets stuff transferred from one person to the next. That's why it's a bit frightening in this generation when sexual promiscuity is just, teenage girls and women have just bought the lie that they're just as capable of going out and having one-night stands as males are. And so it's just spreading. Probably the other big way is through trauma that the enemy gets stuff transferred from one person to the next. So yeah, that makes it a bit hard when someone comes in and they're in a situation where they're not married or where they're living with someone who is not a believer and who's really into some pretty horrible satanic stuff. Really needs an extra layer of prayer protection for her. Because yes, going back home and sleeping with husband and or wife, hopefully one or the other, can just bring a whole lot of stuff back in. Oh dear. So deal with any personal judgments between mother or dad because you are not their judge. So work through your personal judgment of your parents. Accept and apply the work of the cross, His punishment for our forgiveness, His righteousness for our sin, His death for our life. Then there are 10 steps of a specific prayer to work through. And remember, it's not a tick 1, step 1, tick 2, step 3, but it's working through it both head and heart when you work through that with the Lord. All right, so that's just a little bit of a worksheet on breaking curses. Flip over to the next page, page 12. I found a very interesting source that gave 59 of the biblical references to curses and to laws. And it's interesting just reading through what sort of things God has put on the hit list as far as what is sin and what's generational sin. So interesting. When you get a chance, go through and read it. These are a lot from Exodus, where it talks a lot about the laws, the curses, and Deuteronomy, even over to Psalms and some of the other passages in the Bible. So there are 59 things that bring a curse into a person's life. Now, let's dash back and do the conclusion. Or any comments on any of those 2 pages? Try not to dash too quickly through it that you don't have a chance to say, whoa, wait a minute, don't understand. Any questions on either one of those 2 pages? A lot of stuff, huh?
On page 12.
Sorry?
On this list on page 12, number
Yes?
47.
Number 47, on him who keeps his sword from blood. Yeah. Evidently that has to do with people that when it's a godly cause to go into battle and they refuse to go into battle. Probably fear, cowardice, of not being willing to... You'd probably have to go back and read the passage there in 1 Kings and see what the circumstances were as to why. Mm-hmm. So, sorry, try again. Obeying the authority when God told him to go into battle, could be. Yeah. So you probably have to go back and have a look at 1 Kings and Jeremiah and see what that's about. Mm-hmm. Any other comments?
Breaking the law is also a curse, so resisting the law and curses.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a mixture of the laws and curses. So breaking the law brings a curse. It's an interesting study to go through because you can live at 3 different levels. You can live according to the Spirit, you can live according to the law, or you can live under the curse. And we talk about living according to the Spirit. What does that mean? What does it mean to live and walk in the Spirit? To be sensitive to the Holy Spirit, to be under the Lordship of Jesus, to be allowing Him to work in your life and in your heart, to be working through issues in your heart, to be obedient, working through forgiveness, doing all the things that the Lord tells you to do. And you can do it because your free will is involved in it, or you can do it because your church says you have to do it. And that's an example of doing it by the law. All right, so if you belong to a church that says you must fast one day a week and you do that, then and you do it because your church tells you to do it, that's an example of law. You're doing it because the law says to, your church says to. Not because Jesus said to, but because your church said to. Now, if you're in that same church and you say, no, not going to do any fasting, don't believe in it, don't want to have anything to do it, in fact, pastor, da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da to you too, then you probably will bring a curse on your life because you've openly been defiant to authority. I don't feel
that that's right.
Yes,
Decide my
because.
life doesn't believe.
Yes,
And
and get that in there too.
And God hasn't told me.
Good.
Then you can get coming under the Spirit.
Yes. And so you wouldn't be rebellious. You'd be submissive in your attitude, even though you were assertive. All right. So submission and rebellion is an attitude. All right. So you can either walk by the Spirit, walk by the law, and if you break the law, what happens? You come under a curse. Everybody with me on that? Okay, it's like I used to be a teacher and I used to have year 7s in my classroom. So you can imagine a teacher coming into 30 bright year 7s that just would rather be any place than there in your classroom. So they can either enjoy what they're doing and enter into it because they have a free will to enter into it, and therefore they're going to do what you've asked them to do. They're going to be considerate to other people because they want to do it. Or if they don't do that, what does the teacher usually do? No, that's the curse. Yeah, list out a law. So in my classroom, you will be kind to other people. In my classroom, you will not swear. In my classroom, you will not. And, teachers get really good at bringing down a new list of 10 commandments, but that's law. Now, some kids will delight to do what you want them to do in the classroom. Some kids will do it because if they don't, they see the law there, and so they will obey you because of the law. But there'll be a minority of children who do what? Yeah, and so they push just as far as they can, as close as they can. And then you say, okay, Johnny, go see the head teacher. Then that's an example, that's a curse. So the consequences of his breaking the law brought a curse into his life. He had to go see the head teacher. Now, we do that in our own life. We can follow the Lord. See, a light went on. We can follow the Lord out of a free will, an open heart. We can follow the Lord out of our thou must do it because, by the law. Because if we don't follow the law, what's going to happen? We will come under a curse. And many Christians are living under the curse because they've broken the law. So the law is like a safety net. If for no other reason, keep the law. Because if you fall from under the law, you hit the curse. All right? The absolute best is to walk in the Spirit. But if you can't walk in the Spirit, at least follow the law. Because if you can't follow the law, what happens? A curse. Clear as mud? Mostly. Okay, so there's some Bible references to laws and curses. Chew on that for a little while, because when I began to realize the difference between walking in the Spirit, walking under the law, walking by the law, or being under the curse, it brought some really interesting stuff in my own life. Now, before everybody packs up, conclusions. There are various teachings in the church community today about curses and blessings. Often the topic is treated like something elusive, amorphous, vague, or nebulous, like shadows following us, seemingly without a cause. God is a God of law and order. He's not pernicious, which means he doesn't go around and say, well, Maria, you have a broken leg. Sonia, you have cancer. Rose, your marriage breaks up. Kay, you've got a child that has whatever. There must be laws in the spiritual dimension, in the emotional dimension, and in the logical dimension that govern all this stuff. And just because we don't see it doesn't mean that it does not exist. Someday when we stand with Father God, we'll see exactly the reasons why certain things happened in our lives. We'll exactly see cause and effect, cause and effect, cause and effect. Where we don't now, a lot of it's pretty nebulous because we know so little about the spiritual dimension. But I know God is a God of law and order. Just because we do not understand the spiritual world does not mean that the spiritual world is without laws and order. We have found that breaking curses and inner healing are two important and useful tools in the counselor's toolbox. Do not let people put you off about using these tools. They are valid as deliverance and speaking in tongues. And then again, we highly recommend Derek Prince's book. It has been too easy for Christians to be ignorant of causes, blindly yielding to the rule of Satan in their lives. Finding, hearing, and following Jesus through this area of our lives is essential for the full life he has promised us. Next week in our workshop, we can discuss and perhaps do some practical work in some of these topics in our unit. Good. Last minute questions? No last minute questions? Lord Jesus, these two areas are so important in every single person's life here. We do ask that if there's any of these two topics that we as people, as individuals need to work through with you, Lord, I ask that you talk to the people at whatever level they need to in order to hear from you on these areas. Because, Lord, I know the effects of curses in my own life, and I know the effects of curses in other people's life. So, Lord, continue to teach us and show us where you are when it comes to these two topics. And, Lord, I ask a blessing on each person here for their willingness to come out on cold, rainy, windy nights to find some more truth from you, Lord. So a rich blessing on each person here. In your precious name, Jesus. Amen. Now, big tables in the back need to be folded up and put on the trolley. Yeah, I guess I could turn that off.